But then Hans Castorp turns his head. All he sees behind him, overlooking the place these beautiful people are romping, is a classical style temple. It looks sinister. He goes into it, walks along an avenue between columns, and at the center of the temple, what does he find? He finds two aged women, crones, hags, tearing apart the body of a child. Hard to imagine anything more horrible. They see him and curse him in the most vulgar Hamburg dialect. It is not simply something taken from the classical world. It's a perennial possibility in human nature. And when he recovers from his trance and regains consciousness, Hans feels he's had an insight into the possibilities permanently available to humanity, the golden age, but also the blood orgy.
Solomon and Smith. You're about to listen to a conversation between me, Milo, and Ritchie Robertson, our first Scottish guest. It's about Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain again. This time we're talking a bit less about the specific problems of translating the novel and a bit more about the novel in general. Ritchie Robertson is a professor of German literature, one of the sort of most prominent English-speaking Germanists in the world. He's written on an enormous range of authors from like the 17th century onwards. It's hard to find a blind spot in Ritchie Robertson's knowledge of German literature and then European literature more broadly. He's most famous for a big 1,000-page tome on the Enlightenment, probably a kind of unbeatable key to all mythology style comprehensive secondary text on the Enlightenment. He also is the general editor for Oxford World Classics' current run of Thomas Mann translations. He translated himself the novella Death in Venice and the novel Doctor Faustus, and edited the translations of The Magic Mountain, Buddenbrooks, among other books.
So we leap in to the Magic Mountain, as it were, a bit through the Enlightenment cubbyhole that he has carved in that enormous tome, because the Magic Mountain has a lot to say about the Enlightenment. Much of the novel is broken up into discussions between two characters. One is Settembrini, who represents the Enlightenment ideal, the humanist ideal, and another is Naphta, who has this more religious, more revolutionary, more violent version of the world, between whom is our sort of insert character, Hans Castorp. Now, for those who haven't read The Magic Mountain, despite its 1,000 pages, it can be summed quite simply. We have a student engineer who's just finished his exams and he's about to begin in a sort of shipbuilding career, but is a little under the weather. So goes to meet his cousin in a sanatorium up in the mountains of Switzerland, in Davos. He accidentally stays there for 7 years and quite misses his shipbuilding career. And while in this sanatorium, seems to encounter the full breadth of human intellectual experience. He looks into biology, looks into philosophy, looks into skiing and visionary experiences, all of which we discuss and Ritchie Robertson describes in great and fascinating detail.
Hans is a sort of cog in the Faustian engines of German industry up in the north. He himself is not a Faustian figure. He's a consummate mediocrity, the phrase that Vladimir Nabokov famously used to describe Thomas Mann himself. A consummate mediocrity who is caught up in the wheels, the cogs of things greater than him. In a sense, his trajectory throughout the novel is going from a cog to himself an individual. It's about someone becoming an actual human being, an actual kind of full-rounded individual, and not a plot device in somebody else's dreams.
And we don't get much into it, but the mountain is magic. It is. It has special magical abilities. We don't talk about that much. The scholarship is light on the fact that it is a magical mountain, which defies the laws of reality. Should you read it 1,000 times? Someone claimed to Ritchie Robertson that he'd read it 1,000 times. Do we consider this virtuous?
In the afterword, he did say you should immediately read it again. Mann,
and if you keep reading the book, you keep hitting the afterword, and you get caught in the loop, and before you know it, 1,000 times, life's gone.
Yeah, it's a novel that Mann described as being built on a Wagnerian sort of system of motifs. He said every artist is secretly another kind of artist. Every architect is, secretly a painter. Every tap dancer is, secretly a novelist. And he, as a novelist, said he was always secretly a composer. He thinks like a composer, and the Magic Mountain is arranged in a way that maybe has more in common with compositional technique than it does with sort of standard novelistic technique. It remains compelling despite its stasis, because in a sense it could be the most boring novel in the universe. A man stays still for 7 years.
But that's the question for the audience. Why is this book so popular? We sort of skate around it in the interview, but never really come to a definitive answer. But at the time, it sold loads. It's been translated into every conceivable language. It's just been retranslated. People will buy it and read it for all time, even though it's the one where the weird German guy goes up a mountain for 7 years and doesn't get much done. How do we figure that out? Who are these people reading it? We've got two here.
Yeah, why do we like it? I mean, I suppose we're both, typical readers, pretty normal readers.
Standard.
So it's why do we enjoy it? I suppose it's there is a certain rapture, a crucial, passionate, at times kind of erotic intensity with which it deals with all of its subjects. Everything feels very urgent and crucial. People talk in kind of universal terms that sort of transcend the specific situation that the characters find themselves in. Naphta and Settembrini's dialogues feel like they're almost like Platonic dialogues, like they transcend the space in which the novel is taking place. That we're no longer in Switzerland, we're no longer in Davos, we're no longer in the world. In a sense, we're outside the world, looking at the world from above, from a certain vantage point, and it's just so relevant. It feels like it's really, really important for every conceivable kind of human being. Life, death, love, illness, and even the way it deals with its political themes, which maybe you could say are located to a specific time, the sort of interwar Germany, German-speaking world. It still feels almost eternally relevant. There will always be an urge to improve human society to the maximum possible level of happiness, of freedom from fear, and then countering this, there will always be this existential urge of why. You build the H.G. Wells utopia where everybody can be an artist, no one has to work anymore, and everyone's happy, everyone has enough to eat. The somehow human flourishing is able to continue without environmental catastrophe. Everyone's happy. Then the sun explodes. What the hell is going on? What kind of story is that? What kind of basis for human meaning is that? I think that's going to always be relevant.
Yeah, well, I think also it has its formal delights. Reminds me, it's a very different book too, but it reminds me of Middlemarch in that you have large slabs of sort of narrative, digressive material, but then these few very memorable moments that kind of pierce the veil and suddenly explode the story into its moral or intellectual dimensions. And they just linger on the mind. And the chapters we will always go back to are the snow chapter, which we talk about in the interview a little while, and the chapter in which Hans Castorp discovers biology, and it sort of leaps up from the page into his mind. And it's an aspect of a big book that it has its peaks and troughs. The trough's not necessarily bad, but it's material. It's time in the sanatorium. It's incident. But then the incidents themselves often have this kind of Dickensian fun to them. Like the Dr. Behrens, whenever he comes along with his quite comical gait and speaking tendency. And later on we get this enormous Dutchman, Peppercorn, who can never finish a sentence, who is just an entertaining character to hang out with for however many pages. And it is, I think, perhaps because it is a comedy. There are moments when it's a little bit, early on it has this kind of Kafka mood of, is he being trapped in this place forever? Like the walls are closing in. No, take your thermometer. It's a good idea. And there's the great irony of the sanatorium for tuberculosis sufferers being open for visitors when that is an extremely infectious disease. So I think it's very likely Hans Castorp was not a TB sufferer before he showed up and became one by going to the place where you're healed. Fine. But the mood could be very dour, could be very extreme, and the intellectual content implies it, but it's frequently peppered just with comic incidents. The characters are very expansive, almost caricatures, even when they're being serious. And I think it's what Goethe once described Faust as a very serious joke. And I think this is what you could describe the Magic Mountain as. It is very serious, but it's also a joke. And that really makes those 1,000 pages go down smoothly.
Yeah, please like this video and leave a comment. It would be nice if this inspires some of you to go and read it. The Magic Mountain really is a wonderful book. And if you have read it, be curious to know your thoughts. If you want to support me and Milo's continuation of these chats, we also have a Patreon. Be very grateful if you could support us there. You gain access to sort of exclusive content, and it helps us continue to make these videos on the main channel. But without any further ado, here is Ritchie Robertson. Yeah, where are you joining us from today, Ritchie? Are you in Oxford? Are you in?
I'm at home in Oxford, in my front room, which is where I work, looking out onto first of all, onto some bushes, and beyond that, the street.
That's I similar here. I'm in the Rhineland. We got a bushes, we got a cherry tree, we've got a street. I imagine. So thanks so much for making time, Ritchie.
Pleasure.
We start these conversations with a poetic epigraph. I'm going to read a translation of Eichendorff's Sehnsucht. Yearning. The stars, so gold they glisten at the window where I stand, listening, alone, far out of the distance to a post horn in the silent land. The heart burns in my body, lifting secret thoughts to light. Oh, who would travel there with me into that opulent summer night? 2 young journeymen pass over the mountain's margin. I hear them sing by the crevasse across the silent surroundings of stone gorges in seizure where the forests tenderly hiss, of springs that from the fissures surge into woodland abyss. They sing of marble sculptures, of gardens where stones swoon into savage twilit orchards, palaces in the rays of the moon, where girls listen for the purr of lute strings which excite and for the tranquilized stream murmur in the opulent summer night.
Very nice. Is that your own translation?
That is my own. I've been doing these Eichendorffs because I realized there are no rhymed Eichendorff translations. And I think because there's such a folk song kind of music to them, meter to them, that you are really losing, I think, a kind of intolerable amount by omitting rhyme. It needs, for me, to sound a little sing-songy.
Yes, it should. Can you also translate Wilhelm Müller's Lindenbaum, which features in The Magic Mountain?
I could have a go. I mean, not on the fly right now, and certainly not rhymed.
Live on air. Jack translates.
Oh, but it's quite it's wonderful to have that in Thomas Mann. How specific the musical examples tend to be, and I'm sure you found this also in your translation of Dr. Faustus. He does a pretty good job of making you hear the piece secondhand, and the beautiful Lindenbaum passage towards the end of Der Zauberberg, where he tells you the various modulations that are happening with each verse and the way that that feels, the emotional effect of that. It's one of the first things that actually drew me to Mann, was talking to a professor at Nottingham just about classical music, and he was like, I mean, surely you must have read Dr. Faustus, and that was my way in via the music, and it's clearly something that's very precious to Mann. I think there's barely a novel that he writes without an extended musical section.
That's right. His own tastes were quite conservative. His favourite composer was Wagner, and he couldn't really be doing with modern music. So I think we're meant to see Leverkusen in a rather ambivalent way. He's meant to draw on Schoenberg, and there's meant to be something anti-humanistic, impersonal in his compositions, certainly the late compositions.
And there's certain overlaps between the way Adrian speaks and the way that Naphta speaks, for example, in The Magic Mountain. We have this a similar sort of force and urge against Enlightenment humanism that seems to be coming from almost the bowels, from a dark portion of the spirit in a way. It doesn't merely feel like an intellectual exercise in poking holes in the Enlightenment project. It feels like in both the Adrian case and the Naphta case, it's coming from somewhere slightly more subconscious, something operating on darker regions of the psyche. Yeah,
well, that's a very good comparison. And both Naphta and Leverkusen are meant to be sinister figures. Leverkusen, after all, has made a pact with the devil, at least in his own imagination. Naphta is supposed, amazingly, to be both a Jesuit and a communist, and a defender of revolutionary violence.
Yeah, it feels like Naphta would always win an argument irrespective of who his interlocutor was, just due to the sort of pummeling force of his logic. But at the same time, his own internal contradictions are, for that reason, perhaps allowed to go to extravagant lengths. I thought it would actually be quite a good place to sort of formally begin the conversation. The thing you're probably best known for, Ritchie, is a book on the Enlightenment that came out around, I think it was published around 6 years ago.
That's right.
seems to be it's almost like a lifetime's accidental scholarship on Enlightenment scholars that then you wrote in quite a burst, like a 5-year burst, I believe.
That's correct. Yes.
And I wonder how you feel about the Enlightenment and about the reputation of the Enlightenment today. I'm thinking of the criticisms of the Enlightenment coming from maybe on the progressive side of the spectrum, its legacy of racism, of colonialism, of predatory capitalism, and maybe on the conservative side of the spectrum, it's breaking down of transcendental values, of transcendental norms, breaking down the family's unit, all of these things. How do you feel about the Enlightenment, the place of the Enlightenment in contemporary discourse?
I think the Enlightenment is still something indispensable, but its negative side, dark side, had become more visible. What we now call the Third World has only a very marginal place in the Enlightenment, and even the abolition of slavery was not a concern of the main Enlightenment thinkers. It was pursued in Britain. It was pursued by dissenting religious groups outside the mainstream. But I think that enlightenment is indispensable because it encourages people to think for themselves. It's a very familiar quotation, but I'll make it again. Have the courage to think for yourself is the watchword of the Enlightenment in Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? And that means, when necessary, criticizing the Enlightenment. But if you think of what we now take for granted, in human rights, equality before the law, I was about to say gender equality. That's a bit more dodgy. The idea of equality was established by the Enlightenment and gradually extended to more and more population groups. Think of legal reform. Think of the attempt to conduct prisons humanely. I know that seems not to have got very far, but prisons in the 18th century were absolute hellholes. And now at least we know that they ought to be better. A lot of the Enlightenment's work remains to be done. We need to get on with it.
So it's more of a process, more of a way of doing things than it is an isolated historical moment or indeed a project belonging to a specific time and place.
Thank you. I would certainly see it that way. I put the emphasis on enlightenment with a small e, as an ongoing and very, very far from finished process, especially at the present day. I had a chapter in my book, Practical Enlightenment, which has to do with what may sound mundane things like infrastructure, prisons, hospitals, medicine. These practical concerns were very much part of the Enlightenment, which tends to be represented as solely an intellectual movement confined to philosophers and a small public. But in fact, Enlightenment fed down into all sorts of practical concerns, and I was anxious to bring that out. In The Magic Mountain, the representative of the Enlightenment is Settembrini, and Mann quite often pokes fun at him. Nevertheless, Mann said in an essay that Settembrini's ideals are the most positive thing in the novel, even though he himself is to a certain extent a figure of caricature. And a humane and kindly person in contrast to Naphta. One thing which I didn't notice for a long time, until it was pointed out to me, is that Settembrini is homosexual. He's attracted to Hans Castorp, but because he thinks that the atmosphere of the Berghof, the sanatorium, is pernicious, that it weakens the will he urges Hans Castorp to leave, very much against his own inclinations. But Castorp, of course, doesn't do so, mainly because he's fascinated by Clavdia Chauchat. That act of would-be self-denial by Settembrini is something very remarkable. It's something that Aschenbach, in Death in Venice, very much fails to do. He thinks of warning the Taggio family to leave Venice because it's infected by the plague, but in the end, he can't bring himself to do it. Settembrini attempts what Aschenbach failed even to attempt.
And also what Hans fails to attempt as well. Hans lets himself be completely dominated by this passion for Clavdia, for a woman who he, for the majority of the novel, has only shared a few sentences with.
Yes.
He
does for a long time. He becomes obsessed with her. And after they do manage a conversation, and it seems a night together, she leaves the following day, leaving Hans disconsolate. Then, when she reappears several years later, she's in the company of an elderly Dutch coffee planter, Peter Peperkorn. That again is disconcerting. They get on reasonable terms, have an honest conversation, and even a kiss. But the relationship as such was very brief. Nevertheless, it's an experience of love. And along with death, is among the experiences to which the magic mountain, the sanatorium, admit Hans and enlarge his horizon.
Hans's progress in the novel is, Mann described it as a Geistessteigerung, like a soul climbing up from where it happens to be at the beginning. Where we find him at the beginning is in an active life, a life preparing to go into shipbuilding, to being in a world of commerce, a world of action, a world maybe not too dissimilar from the sort of vision of Faust at the end of part 2. He's going to build canals. It's the world of progress. It's the world of pushing things forward, and a very post Protestant Germanic vision of a sort of business, an active business life. And Hans is only able to reflect on other things, on a life of contemplation, of love, of death, is only able to get out of quite a mediocre strata of consciousness by being forced into inaction, or forcing himself into a kind of inaction, forcing himself to become a sort of anti or reverse Faustian figure, who, rather than doing everything, extending the sea, limits himself both to a specific geographical place and to a specific regimen, way of doing things. I wonder if you could expand a bit upon this, on the kind of man, the kind of figure that Hans is at the beginning of the novel, and what happens to him. What does this Geistessteigerung consist in?
Okay, well, I see what you mean, but I would slightly query the comparison with Faust. Because Hans is not a very active character. He's rather dreamy and passive. He's very fond of beer. We're even told what kind of beer. And he likes sitting in a kind of alcohol-induced daze. Well, 5,000 feet above sea level, alcohol has a bad effect on him, and he presently leaves us alone. I think at the beginning, Hans is in something of a rut. Yes, he's about to embark on a career working for a firm of shipbuilders, but he doesn't give the impression of dynamism. He doesn't seem like an embodiment of Weber's Protestant ethic, which people have also read into the Faust of Part 2, Act 5, the sanatorium takes him in a number of new directions, and it does, over the course of 7 years, make a new person of him. Mann worked into the latter part of the novel imagery of Steigerung, alchemical transmutation, to suggest that Hans does undergo a heightening, a refining of his powers. But I would see the development that Hans undergoes rather differently. His stay in the Berghof brings him face to face with some fundamental experiences. Love is one, death is another. There's an atmosphere of death. We keep hearing about it. We keep hearing how some patients are hived off and called moribundum, those about to die. Their state is kept a secret from the other inmates as far as possible. We hear about another sanatorium further up, where the corpses of patients who die are taken down to a lower level on bobsleighs. Hans Castorp at one point becomes fascinated by the dying people and pays a round of visits to them. And that is partly morbid, but also humane. He faces what one would much prefer to see covered up. And it brings out also his essentially good and humane nature. But he also develops, above all, through the death of his cousin Joachim. Joachim is an army officer. He loves his profession. He desperately to go back to the flatland, the Flachland, and rejoin his regiment. But when he's allowed to leave the Berghof, it's a false dawn. And a few months later, he's back worse than ever. His death is a great loss to Castorp. The two always go about together. The director of the Berghof refers to them as Castor and Pollux, the heavenly twins. So Joachim is a great loss. But we also see how Joachim faces death. He knows, of course, he's dying, and he faces up to it with military courage. The chapter in which he approaches death is headed als Soldat und brav, as a soldier brave, a quotation from Faust Part 1, where it counts the dying words of Gretchen's brother Valentin. Ich gehe durch den Todesschlaf zu Gott ein als Soldat und brav. I go through the sleep of death to God as a soldier brave. So Joachim is definitely one of the unequivocally positive figures in the novel. And the experience of bereavement, of course, helps to shape Hans Castorp, along with the experience of love. You also see in the course of the novel how he becomes more independent. After Naphta appears and engages in endless arguments with the Settembrini, Hans is between them both. He can never quite follow what's going on, and he gets rather clueless interjections, for which Settembrini tells him off. But eventually, Hans outgrows his mentors. He doesn't need their advice anymore. He sees them simply as representing relative points of view among many others. And the place where that happens is the chapter called Schnee, Snow, where Hans goes out skiing. You're not supposed to do that. He's breaking the rules of the Berghof. That's already a sign of independence. And he gets lost in the snow. He takes refuge in a rather rickety alpine hut. And he has a vision, first of all, of beautiful people enjoying themselves, playing sports, beside a beautiful blue Mediterranean-style lagoon. There's also there a nursing mother with a baby at her breast. There's also an image of life and fertility, as well as health and happiness. But then Hans Castorp turns his head. And what he sees behind him, overlooking the place these beautiful people are romping, is a classical style temple. It looks sinister. He goes into it, he walks along an avenue between columns, and at the center of the temple, what does he find? He finds two aged women, crones, hags, tearing apart the body of a child. Hard to imagine anything more horrible. And they see him and curse him in the most vulgar Hamburg dialect. So this is not simply something taken from the classical world. It's a perennial possibility in human nature. And when he recovers from his trance and regains consciousness, Hans feels he's had an insight into the possibilities permanently available to humanity, the golden age, but also the blood orgy. Human beings have these two poles, these two possibilities. The right position for humanity to take up is between the two. The paradise on the shore is wonderful, but you can't have it again. It's a dream. The scene in the temple is a nightmare. But things like it can happen, and it's very important to know about these possibilities, but not be fascinated by murder, blood, and sacrifice. That's part of the world of Naphta. The dream leaves Castorp positioned between the dystopia of Naphta and the utopia imagined by Settembrini. And although he doesn't remember his dream a couple of hours later, it sinks into his unconscious and has a lasting effect on him. The vision by the lagoon is, as it were, the possibility of a good human life, which the Enlightenment struggle towards. In actual life, Settembrini is a somewhat more equivocal figure. His ideals are not altogether honest. As Naphta points out, Settembrini is defending the current order of things, capitalism, and turning a blind eye to the exploitation which is part of capitalism. On the other hand, Naphta wants to do away with capitalism and institute a communist society where everybody is equal and nobody is free, is a great deal worse. So these are some of the broad lines of Hans Castorp's development. But if I talk about it in that rather global way, I miss out half the fun of the novel, which lies in the interplay of personalities.
Yes.
With Castorp, Joachim, Behrens, the director of the Berghof, Clavdia Chauchat, and many others, are all vividly realized, rounded characters. And that's why, if you approach The Magic Mountain simply as a novel of ideas, well, it is that. But you forget that it offers also the traditional satisfaction of a novel, lifelike characters, and emotional involvement.
And it brings the question, often people describe The Magic Mountain as a difficult book. It's sort of in that category. And I wonder, what makes a difficult book? And does The Magic Mountain really qualify? Because as you say, it has this richness of character. And I think even if you don't follow precisely Settembrini and Naphta's various elusive philosophical discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
indeed, there's evidence that Thomas Mann wasn't exactly a sort of a masterfully learned philosopher himself. He was piecing
Mm-hmm.
this stuff together as he went,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
one nonetheless experiences their sort of diametric quality. And you can embody Hans Castorp, who doesn't really seem to fully comprehend. He does have this
Mm-hmm.
notion, as you express in the dream, there are two possible worlds.
Mm-hmm.
But is it nonetheless right to categorize The Magic Mountain as a difficult book?
Don't be too impressed by its appearance of massive intellectuality. As you say, Mann cobbled together the speeches of Naphta and Settembrini from a small number of sources, and did so very skillfully. Another passage that people sometimes have difficulty with is the one that details Hans Castorp's reading. In the sanatorium, he has a lot of bed rest, and for lack of anything else to do, he reads lots of books, including medical and scientific treatises, in order to learn more about his condition. And the medical information is presented, what seems to me a quite accessible, humorous way. The reader can get an education as well as Hans Castorp from these passages, but one shouldn't be intimidated by them. One aspect of the novel that one easily forgets is that it's a democratic novel. Mann wrote it when he had come to terms with a democratic Germany of the Weimar Republic. These intellectual passages are meant to make the material accessible to any interested reader. So I would say just read them, take in what interests you. If you get bored, turn over the page, and you may go back to them later. But if you reflect on these passages, what you may be left with, perhaps should be left with, is an antithesis between two ways of looking at the world: a religious view and a secular view. The religious view taken by Naphta, admittedly in very extreme form, looks for salvation in the church. As a Jesuit, he's a Roman Catholic. The alternative view expressed by Settembrini looks for human betterment in a liberal and free society. Now, admittedly, the degree of freedom available within a liberal society is questioned, as I said earlier, but it offers very much more than the theocracy which Naphta is a spokesman. Naphta, by the way, I think this is generally known, is partly based on Georg Lukács, whom Mann met in, I think, 1922. Lukács had been involved in the Hungarian communist government that briefly took power at the beginning of the 20s. Naphta's style of argument, his aggression, his habit of driving his opponent into a corner and bringing out and then giving the killer punch introduced by Thor, that is very much based on Lukács' manner. The novel opens up large horizons and invites you to think beyond Naphta and Settembrini, really to the purpose of human life, to questions of utopia, whether an earthly utopia can be created, or whether such attempts are bound to end up in dystopias like the one Naphta envisages. I think one should regard the novel as some liberating one's mind, not as driving one into a corner or making one feel inferior, as Naphta does, but as opening up wider horizons.
It's interesting that you bring up Georg Lukács, who famously or infamously described Naphta as a pre-fascist and denied the similarity with himself, which creates an interesting kind of a intellectual crosshatch. But I think your mentioning of it being a democratic book is interesting and very relevant because, of course, the paradox of books like The Magic Mountain or Ulysses, which are infamous for their difficulty, is they're also extremely popular, and they have
Yes.
survived, and they are read by many millions of people. You can imagine a difficult book sliding into obscurity, as many have, but these books, despite them being, sometimes up to 1,000 pages, and despite being filled with these sort of intellectual games, seem to appeal across a century to a wide variety of people, and not just wide, but also deep. Adorno said, it's you got to read the book 3 times, which is, that's a 3,000 page commitment. But in your introduction, you claim to have met someone who said he'd read it up to 1,000 times. So
I
if
did
that,
meet such a person, and when pressed, he said he had read many passages so often there must amount to 1,000 complete readings. I'm still a bit skeptical, but never mind. I read The Magic Mountain in the course of my life 4 times, and when editing this volume for the World's Classics, I read the translation several times, and it stands up. I think I've read Ulysses three times, but I shall never read it in full again, because I find it very, very uneven, and some passages are very boring. Joyce meant them to be boring. The passage in the Cabman's Shelter, for example,
Emmaus, yes.
which is entirely in cliches, was meant to have that effect, but
Once is
anyway,
enough.
but all the passages in Ulysses about with Leopold Bloom in the foreground, I reread many times. If you want an example of a difficult novel which is less accessible, I would say Musil's The Man Without Qualities. Again, I've read many passages from that many times, but I've never read the whole thing right through. Musil himself didn't finish it. But I think one difference from The Magic Mountain is that the reflective passages, the essayistic passages, are not even perfunctorily integrated with a narrative. They just sit there. Whereas with the Magic Mountain, Naphta and Settembrini are at least having a lively, in fact, very combative conversation. And with the medical passages, they're not just plunked there on the page. Hans Castorp is reading them for a very personal reason. He wants to learn about the body, not only his body, but also the body of Clavdia Chauchat. So the medical details have an erotic fascination for him, and that carries him on. I think the reader picks up something of that. Not to mention that he comes up against the limits of knowledge, because at one point the narrator, paraphrasing Hans Castorp's thoughts, says, "And what was life? Nobody knew." So I think one should enjoy these passages for their own sake, connect them to the characters whose thoughts or words they express, and certainly not feel intimidated.
and do you think the 3 readings is necessary, as Adorno says? Does the 3rd reading really crack it open, or is that a slightly unnecessary ask?
Well, that's certainly my experience, but I think that rereading is as important an activity as reading anyway. And for me, I don't possess or release a book until I've read it for the second time.
I think the second reading thing is definitely true for lots of aspects of the Magic Mountain. Lots of the things, lots of the effects do come across much more powerfully on a reread. I'm reminded especially of Hans's flashback to his childhood crush, Pribislav Hippe, this chapter, who has certain eerie physical similarities to Clavdia. especially around the eyes, which are described as Kyrgyz eyes
That's
or
right.
Mongolian eyes or
Mm-hmm.
eyes of the East. There are all
Mm-hmm.
sorts of ways in which Hans's erotic fixations,
Mm-hmm.
fascinations are eastward leaning, something that
Mm-hmm.
Settembrini also warns him against.
Mm-hmm.
He sees the East as a zone of barbarism, of anti-humanism, I suppose, and the West as or Europe, Western Europe, as the appropriate place for the Settembrini Enlightenment
Mm-hmm.
project.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I wonder whether you could elaborate a bit on the homosexuality within the novel, on Hans's attraction to Clavdia being, in a sense, a homosexual attraction 1 degree removed into another person, almost through the figure of Pribislav, who she resembles, and then also about Settembrini's attraction to Hans.
Well, Settembrini attraction to Hans is conveyed very indirectly, and I think there's not a great deal more to say about it.
Mm.
The best book I've read about Mann and homosexuality points out that he liked women who were a bit boyish, a bit conventionally unfeminine. His wife Katya, for example, looked quite boyish, and the more so she grew older. Clavdia is I hate to use these terms, but in quotes, a little bit mannish in her gestures and body language, for example. She slouches and goes about with her hands in her pockets. So I think there's something of that. I don't think the homosexual theme bulks large in the novel beyond that. You have to wait for Dr. Faustus, with great love of Leverkusen's life, is his friend Rudi Schwerzfeger.
It's an aspect, I suppose, because of the historical period in which we're reading it, that is maybe quite striking for readers. I remember when my wife first read it, she was quite struck at just how frank it was, especially for a 100-year-old book. Maybe it wasn't read as frank at the time. Maybe at the time there was enough plausible deniability in the earlier scenes, in this flashback scene where Hans first takes the not particularly subtle Freudian symbol of the pencil from Pribislav. Yeah.
I find that Freudian image rather crude. When he wrote The Magic Mountain, Mann had not yet sat down to read Freud, but obviously he picked up a great deal in conversation and worked some Freudian, very Freudian images in, and perhaps it would have been better not to do so. But I think the homosexuality in the novel would have seemed very discreet to readers 100 years ago. But in Death in Venice, where it's much more blatant, Mann thought there he was very discreet, and I think we have to accept that readers 100, 120 years ago were much more innocent than we are.
Yeah, and that maybe goes for all of the other sort of slightly more divergent erotic impulses in the novel. There is not an entirely subtle amount of sort of necrophilia in there as well, and sort of Hans's and something you were saying in the Forschungen biological textbooks chapter, Hans's erotic fixation on the sheer human anatomy from the inside and out could also maybe trouble our slightly more our age that has slightly larger antenna for these sorts of sexually deviant aspects of the novel. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the Russian Revolution. Hans's obsession, Clavdia, is Russian, and
Yes.
there is a sense in which, and I'm not sure how much Hans knew about it, but in which the Russian Revolution fulfills both the criteria of a Settembrinian project and a Naphtharian one. It is a sort of a slightly religious in tone autocratic movement that had certain dystopian manifestations, especially after the publication of the Magic Mountain, when Stalin took the reins, but already under Lenin. The problems with the Bolsheviks were already sort of apparent to certain figures in Europe by the time the Magic Mountain was being written, not least of which would be Lukács as well, who was immediately a critique of Leninism. But I wonder how much it does loom in the novel and how much it was in Mann's imagination and in his thoughts while he was writing it. There are just certain times when the specific form of utopianism prescribed by either Naphta or Settembrini have really eerie overlaps with Russia. This combined with Settembrini's insistence that the revolution or the Enlightenment project cannot happen in the East. I wonder whether these readings are at all justified or not.
I don't think one can get very far looking for references to the Russian Revolution, especially since the novel ends in 1914. But then, of course, we have Naphta. We have the fact that Mann experienced the Munich Soviet, the Räterepublik, that was set up briefly in 1919 and violently put down by a combination of government forces and paramilitaries, soldiers demobbed from the First World War who were looking for something to do. So communism was certainly felt as a threat. It wasn't safely distant in Russia. It had existed in Hungary and briefly in Munich. I think in Naphta you have, although he's a rather fantastic communist, a warning against a communist government. You remember the passage where Naphta is asked how the universal republic is to be instituted and defended, and he replies, by terror. And everyone starts back. They haven't realized that he's so 200% serious about a dictatorship. So I think Naphta, among many other things, does embody a serious warning against communist dictatorship. Other than that, I don't think that the events of the Russian Revolution impinge on the novel very much.
What do you make of the decision to make Clavdia Russian?
It all fits in with the presentation of the East, which one could take exception to. The word Orientalism comes to mind. You see, she embodies the conception of the East as timeless, lacking in order, shapeless, inclined to mysticism. She and her friends, who she tells Castorp about, were great readers of Dostoevsky, and liked the idea that the greatest sinner is also the greatest saint. Well, that's one dimension one to forget about. The metaphysical extremes that you find in a novel like the Brothers Karamazov. That's part of the image of Russia in the novel. Well, in Settembrini's eyes, Russia is a place of stagnation, opposition to Western progress. In Clavdia, is a place of spiritual adventures and experiments. And it exercises a fascination for the West, which Mann is concerned both to acknowledge, explore, but also warn against.
I think there's an interesting substratum just on the subject of revolution in general between the Settembrini and Naphta positions. And it's this sense of when the Enlightenment project is complete, and one can view that as a very long project, when suffering is eliminated and a kind of equality under some market system is established, as Settembrini sort of dreams of in a very Fabian way. Naphta's overwhelming question is a sort of, well, what then? What is the meaning of life once you've solved all the problems? When you have this completely negative interpretation of reality, just removing pain until no pain exists. And this is a fairly compelling rebuttal. It's one that most humanists don't really have to deal with because we're so far off. It's like, well, we'll cross that bridge of existential panic when it occurs, and we don't need to do it now. But since the book was written, obviously there's been various existential crises in European thought. But have we got any closer to marrying the Enlightenment project of general humanistic improvement with a sort of post-salvation, post-revolutionary state of being?
These speculations seem so remote, especially in the age of climate crisis and other threats to humanity. That it's rather difficult to pursue them. And the question of the value of human life in the future comes up against the question of the value of human life at this moment. The trouble with some ideas of progress is that they defer value to the remote future, and thus devalue the present. So I think rather than putting one's money on a utopia at the end of history, one should attend to the present. And I'm not sure how far one can deduce that belief from the novel, but it's a belief that I and many other people hold.
I suppose that's the difference of the religious view attempts to figure eternity and the ultimate state within a lifetime. As in, once one has died, they reach the new metaphysical transcendental plane. And therefore, in Naphta's mind, the conflict is personal. Whereas I suppose your argument, which does work well with Settembrini's position, is simply to solve the problems as they occur, and that in the solving of them there is meaning generated, and that is something that can direct mankind. And when we reach that, and again, climate crisis will make it fairly distant, but if we do reach this point where everyone is more or less all right, then that's simply a different problem to encounter, and the meaning becomes encountering that set of issues.
Marx said that when communism arrived, history could begin, not at all the spirit of Naphta, but meaning once economic and political problems were resolved, people could start asking how to make life more meaningful. And I think that if and when that time comes, new possibilities will confront humanity. The novel, of course, doesn't end with any such outlook. It ends on a battlefield in the Western Front in the autumn of 1914. And a question people often raise is, what have Hans Castorp's 7 years of the Magic Mountain led to if he goes and dies, as he very probably does, in what now seems a senseless war? I'm not sure that I have a ready answer to that question.
It leads to him being able to die while singing, I suppose. There's something to do with the good humor with which he faces catastrophe and ruin. There's something quite admirable, for me at least, and when I read it in a young man singing the Schubert song in this hellscape with bombs falling all around him. Granted, quite it's touching in maybe quite a dark way. It's not a very optimistic vision, but you know, I mean, every human being is dead and is in much less than 100 years in most cases. I suppose not to say that the catastrophic loss of young life in war isn't unspeakably tragic, but that you know, death is an inevitability, and being able to face death with a certain courage and a certain levity and good humor is something genuinely admirable.
Well, that would certainly be true of Hans Castorp, and two other things occur to me. First, he stands out from other soldiers because he is singing the Lindenbaum under his breath, whereas in the attack on the fortress of Logemark, which these events are based on, most of the soldiers sang patriotic songs like Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. So Hans Castorp has become an individual and preserves his individuality in the face of death. The other thing is that in joining up, he is doing his duty in an unquestioning way, like Joachim, and that I think is something positive. Also, it's worth remembering that the second last word of the novel is love. Liebe wird aus diesem Weltfest des Todes einmal die Liebe steigen. Will this worldwide festival of death one day permit the emergence of love? So I don't think it's a nihilistic book, but it faces the threats to humanity that were obvious in its day.
We get sort of a few little echoes of Nazism in the novel. What's the word for an echo that happens in reverse? I'm thinking particularly of the visit of the anti-Semite to the sanatorium.
Premonitions.
Premonitions, yes. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. It's not a novel that can engage with Nazism head on. It maybe it's still written in a time where the extent of the catastrophe that's about to face Germany was still unthinkable. But we do get these premonitions of Nazism. First of all, in the visit of an anti-Semite to the sanatorium during a chapter, I think called the Great Madness, the Skorsavansen, and then also in this, in a sense, in this fascination with the occult, which is in Dr. Faustus maybe more elaborately brought out. The idea that Germany has, in a sense, done a deal with the devil in accepting Nazism or going down this path. I wonder if you could speak a bit about these aspects of the novel.
Well, I think to bring in Nazism, it's going a bit far.
Yeah.
Certainly, the year in which the novel was published was the one in which Hitler was put in prison for his part in the beer hall putsch in Munich. But he still didn't seem to be as great a threat as he turned out to be. I think they use some conflicts in the chapter called the große Stumpfsinn,
Yeah.
the great dullness.
Stupidity.
Perhaps suggest the various conflicts going on in Europe in the years before the First World War, the two Balkan Wars, for example. I think one can go too far in reading political events back into the novel.
It happens a lot with like Kafka and the Holocaust as well, where people read. It's impossible, sort of from a certain historical standpoint, not to see certain overlaps. But I understand why, like from a critical perspective. Yeah,
of course. But when you think of what was going on in Kafka's lifetime, you can see plenty of real events, which in fantastic form go into his novels. In the penal settlement, for example, it really is about European colonialism. Arbitrary arrest did happen before 1914, hence the trial. So Kafka is not such a fantasist as people make out.
Thank you so much for your time. We've got one last question. An interesting idea, sort of in contrast to what we've just been talking about now, is Susan Sontag's criticism of Mann, which is not in particular about the magic mountain, but she describes him as over-cooperative, which is to say that he inserts the interpretation of his novel too boldly into the novel itself. He sort of leads you on this pathway of ideas and outcomes. For instance, the theme of time, which is, I think, very cleverly woven through the novel structurally, formally, and in subject. But frequently, Mann will come out and tell you, by the way, this is about time and various things to do with time, and he will express the idea, not simply letting it sort of lay down in the subconscious. What do you make of this criticism? Is it fair, or does it miss Mann's move?
I can see the point, but some of these interventions by the narrator feel a bit heavy-handed. At the same time, the relationship Mann establishes between the narrator and the reader is one in which some narrative interventions are expected and understood. It begins with the narrator announcing the kind of story he's going to tell, establishing a relationship with the reader, which is taken up again on occasion throughout the novel. So I think this guidance of the reader, providing it's fairly gentle, is quite acceptable.
Thank you once again for making time.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.